Hello everyone and welcome to Climate Australia. I am your host, Lee Constable, and I'd like to start, as I mean to go on, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm broadcasting to you today. I'm here on Turrbal land. I'm just north of Meanjin, Brisbane, on what is known today as Redcliffe on the Condamooka coast. So I want to pay my respects to elders past and present of the Turrbal people, as well as the Gubbi Gubbi people to the north, and acknowledge their ongoing relationship with land, sea and sky, and that climate justice for First Nations people across what is now known as Australia as well as the world goes hand in hand with climate action for us all. Thank you so much for joining me today. This episode is a bit of a best practice, a bit of introducing a new person to the show, and making sure that you can all start thinking about this important process of decision making. So my guest today is Mayuran. He is, let me get his actual bio in front of me. He's many things, but he's the Managing Director of Adaptation, which you might hear a little bit more about as we go. Mayuran is actually here because he's an expert in all things complexity, risk, decision making, and also working with multiple stakeholders on those issues. We talked a lot about all the different projects that Mayuran's been involved in, and there are many. And over the years in management consulting firms with partners, Mayuran's worked on everything from working with business and conservationists, societal work, working with leaders, First Nations people. He's working to understand and respond to the risks and opportunities of climate change. So risk and opportunities. You might not often hear the word opportunities of that. He has over 15 years of experience working with both private and public sectors in Australia and also North America. I know we've got some people in the US watching the live stream today. Hello to you, whether you're watching in Simpatico TV or on YouTube or Facebook. Mayuran also, he's obviously a bit of a sucker for punishment because he loves to solve complex sustainability challenges. And as we all know, being here on Climate Australia, they are complex challenges. And he likes to use approaches from the risk and decision sciences. So very much a science, evidence-based approach to decision making. And those are things that we all grapple with as individuals and as members of organisations and in our workplaces. So I'm really looking forward to this chat today, which comes under the title of Solving Complex Challenges, Decision Making in the Face of Uncertainty and Risk. So without further ado, I will invite Mayuran. Hello, good morning.
Morning, Lee. Lovely to be here. Thanks for the very kind words.
It's great to have you here. Now, today's topic will give people a 101 on that. What do you mean when you say decision making? Who's that for?
Yeah, great opening question. So, look, I think individually we all make decisions, on a day-to-day basis. We choose, what we're going to have for lunch. We're going to choose what to wear, to work or socially. And organizations are similar. Organizations make all sorts of different decisions, at different frequencies on a daily basis. More routine decisions like who's going to be working, what checkout at what time if you're in a store, to much more complex decisions around, how much are we going to invest in particular new products in R&D, for example? What are we going to do from a climate change standpoint, for example, in terms of setting climate targets, in terms of emissions reduction? And so there's a whole suite of different decisions that organizations make. And the work I do is, especially on those more complex decisions, help with good processes by which to make those decisions. And a lot of the work we do, basically draws upon, over 50 years of science in studying how effective decisions have been made by, everyone from successful, private sector organizations to organizations in the government sector.
Yeah, and this poses a lot of different challenges. So how would you talk to an organization about making decisions? Does it depend on whether the organisation is government, whether they're private, or do you find that everyone's kind of got similar challenges when it comes to that sort of thing?
Yeah, similar but quite different depending on the context. So usually we sort of you know, people are interested to talk to us and we're interested to talk to them if they've got sort of one of two issues. One is if they've got a particular problem, like they're looking at a problem that they're trying to solve and they're not really sure either where to start or how they're going to go about solving that problem. So that's sort of one particular context in which using a more decision-led approach, and I can sort of go into a little bit more of that shortly, can be really useful. And the second context in which we often find ourselves helping clients is in where there's a struggle to get a commitment to action. So people have identified a problem, they've looked at alternatives, and they've got to a point, and they're not really sure how to move forward because for whatever reason they don't quite have a commitment to actually move forward on it, or there's too much uncertainty in terms of the outcomes, or simply they just don't have buy-in. Within a public sector context, there's particular action like a new infrastructure project, or the choice of how one might route, for example, a new railway or a new highway comes with opposition from the community, or from in a private sector context, you've got large organizations with multiple functions, multiple viewpoints, multiple lenses, and differing opinions on how one should move forward. And so those situations lead to sort of paralysis in being able to actually move forward. And if you think about both those contexts, what people are trying to do is take action. They're trying to do something, and in all of those contexts, they've got choices. And anytime you're trying to make an action or take an action and you've got choices, you've basically got a decision to make. And so that's usually the context in which we usually get engaged. It's you're trying to take action, but you're not sure how to actually get the buy-in and have the basis to be able to move forward.
Yeah, that sounds like something that might make people tear their hair out, but as I said in the intro, it's something that you actually have run towards instead of away from. Could you just give people a little bit of a background to how you kind of got into this area of work and what expertise you are drawing on when you're doing this work?
Yeah. So look, I'm an environmental engineer by discipline. I've also got a finance background, and very early on in my career, I got involved working with an organization that was looking at helping clients advance the sustainability agenda that they had. And some of my earliest experiences were working with clients that wanted to implement projects that had a benefit from a non-financial standpoint. So, for example, one of the earliest projects I worked with was a water utility, and they had this fantastic project which was at a wastewater treatment facility to basically reuse the waste emissions from the facility and use it to actually generate energy using a technology called Cogeneration. And it's fantastic work for 18 months, and they got it to a point where technologically they were able to sort of characterize it and see what it could do. They were able to sort of identify the benefits from an emission standpoint, but it didn't quite stack up from a financial perspective, and so they just couldn't get it over the line. They knew that it made sense. we're capturing our own emissions, we're using it to supply energy. We buy energy from a coal-fired grid, and so there's an additional benefit in terms of this reuse. But because the financial proposition wasn't quite stacking up based on their internal sort of thresholds, they were sitting there going, well, how do we prove this out? And so this is where I was first exposed to some of the more formal approaches of decision making and decision science. And again, decision science has been around for over 50 years, and it really brings a suite of different approaches and tools that help move people from properly identifying a problem, through to establishing the fact base, so the knowledge and data, etc. Using a logical analysis to be able to sort of understand your choices and the trade-offs and the consequences of those, and then to be able to get that most important commitment to action. And that's sort of where I started. And it was actually in sustainability decision making. I then moved to the US, where which is where a lot of the great thinking and advancement in the science of decision making is, certainly in the private sector. I think Stanford and MIT are sort of two of the pioneer and sort of leading practice academic institutions that do a lot of publications in the space. But there's a lot more work over there in both the pharmaceutical sectors and the upstream oil and gas sectors, and also in conservation, using these approaches and tools to get from a problem through to a solution. So it was actually moving there that I got really exposed to some of the real science behind it, and then have sort of brought that back to Australia and have continued to apply that.
Yeah. Wow. And it's not necessarily something that I think, well, maybe it's becoming more of an obvious career path now, but I think traditionally when you think of things like engineering and things like that, you don't necessarily think of working on these problems in this kind of way. Or consulting, I suppose, is now a huge part of what engineers end up doing. Because you're working with complexity, whether that's within a machine or a human and machine system, or the global systems and human systems as well. I wanted to talk about risk though. How does risk play a role in decision making? And kind of, I might also combine in that next question that I have, which is about the relationship with these things and climate change.
Sure. So one of the things we talk about in decision making, one of the first things we do in helping clients frame up their sort of decision problems is actually a fair bit of emphasis and focus on objectives. And what is you've got a problem, but you're solving that problem to achieve something, and what you're trying to achieve is trying to further some objective or some combination of objectives that you have. And so that the tie between that and risk, so risk, the ISO, the international standard definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. That's what it's defined as in terms of the in terms of what we most private and public sector organizations sort of apply when they look at risk. And so that the connection between decision making and risk is really around objectives. So ultimately, when one is trying to make a decision between choices, you're trying to make a decision between those choices in terms of how they how they compare in terms of their ability to deliver those objectives. And then when you look at the risk lens on top of that, risk is then, well, what's the uncertainty I have on those choices being able to deliver those objectives? And so if there was no uncertainty in terms of our choices, then decision making would be quite simple, because you'd be able to understand, if I do X, I'll get this, and if I do Y, I'll get this. But it's uncertainty that creates the complexity in terms of these choices and these problems. And so effectively what risk is a lens on uncertainty in how we look at choices and the potential consequences, the trade-offs of those choices. And that's what you're ultimately trying to weigh up. You're trying to weigh up, if I'm looking at doing one thing versus another, how confident am I that the particular choice that I choose is going to deliver what I think it's going to deliver in alignment with my objectives.
Yeah, and I saw people in your area share kind of those graphs, like the one I had up on the screen there, where you've got things like you've got conflict resolution at the top there, and then you've got joint fact finding. How do you make sense of something like this? Because obviously it's a very useful tool to you. You're in the know, but how would someone who's in an organization dealing with risk around whether it's pandemic, climate crisis, and weather extremes kind of grapple with this?
Yeah, so it's a really eloquent sort of description of some of the different approaches that one uses and one can use in different contexts, different decision contexts. So we talk about, in a lot of what I've talked about today, sort of is what we classify as structured decision making. We've got this very structured process by which you're going to identify a problem, tackle the problem, and move forward. The relevance of this in the climate context is in that why decision making is so critical in this upcoming decade of sort of action in response to climate change is that there's so much uncertainty in terms of the consequences of climate change, and that's on multiple fronts. So, if you look at it from a mitigation standpoint, and you look at sort of the transition that's occurring already in terms of moving to non-fossil fuel sources of energy, the pace at which that happens, and the pace at which different regulators, different governments impose prices on carbon, the pace at which investments made in those spaces is going to it is uncertain, and that uncertainty means that if you're a business and you have a particular assumption about how much you're paying for power, who you're buying power from, etc. Well, it's highly likely that some of those assumptions are going to be flipped on their head within the next 10 to 15 years, and that creates a whole bunch of uncertainty that impacts if you're looking to renegotiate a new power contract, or your last contract's up for renewal. You're not trying to grapple with how quickly some of those changes are going to happen in the economy. Impacts the choices you have and the solutions you might come up with. And similarly on the adaptation side, whilst there's obviously strong consensus about climate change, we still don't know what's the pace of change going to be? What's the ultimate? Is it 1.5 degrees, 2.5 degrees? We don't know with the certainty that we'd love to know what those pathways look like in terms of what those implications are. And so, if you're if you're an asset owner that's got, let's say, a desal plant on the coast, and you're trying to make decisions on should you be investing in additional storm protection, or should you be investing in engineering solutions to elevate parts of your facility because they might be exposed to storm surges, you're still working with a very broad range of assumptions and possible scenarios in terms of what might happen, which impacts the choices that you're looking at. And so this is where a lot of the thinking at the moment in the science space is that one needs to be thinking about adaptive management. And so I think that chart you showed there, she talked about structured decision making as being quite a useful approach within quite a lot of sort of degrees of freedom of science understanding and objectives. But certainly in the climate space, what that means is that the choices businesses make are going to need to be a little bit more pragmatic. They're going to need to think about phasing investments. They're going to need to think about, making investments that are resilient to a number of different scenarios. And that's quite a new concept compared to, 10, 15, 20 years ago. I was a hydrologist for those first couple of years of my career, which is basically, studying rainfall patterns and using those to develop flood models for infrastructure. And the way we do those things is to look at, the last 50 years of rainfall, 100 years of rainfall, and then, we have these curves that tell us what's the rainfall in a 1 in 50 year event, 1 in 100 year event, and you design things for those sort of thresholds. Well, what climate change is doing is it's creating a whole bunch of uncertainty in terms of what is a 1 in 50 year event, what is a 1 in 100 year event, and that uncertainty is what makes decision making difficult moving forward.
Yeah, and I can think of lots of different scenarios that might be just like to do with this year even. I think COVID's kind of given us this great model accidentally for enabling more people to think of things in terms of climate crisis, because suddenly, event planners who were used to just planning the conference or the live event or whatever it was, sometimes, like I think about National Science Week, for instance, in August in Sydney, it was kind of 3 different plans for one event I was involved in. Or one of the events here in Brisbane, there was one event plan that went ahead, but those event planners had to have what if we need to change to having tables even further apart? Are we selling too many tickets to enable that? Do we need to sell less tickets at a higher price but have them further apart so that people can distance in the venue the way that they have to with the regulations? And then what is our plan to do a virtual event if that's not even possible? And that's kind of like a small scale thing. And then I think about farmers. Like, we've had a lot of farmers on the channel, and my family are farmers, and you're constantly having to think about making decisions in the face of uncertainty and risk. Who out there do you think is giving a good example of how to do that?
So I think there's lots of great examples of good practice and leading practice. I think historically, sectors which have got a lot of R&D in their sort of life cycle. So I think I mentioned earlier, the pharmaceutical sector that has to do, when you're doing it's quite topical, obviously, with the vaccines and the work that's going on. But, the amount of investment, certainly in North America with the FDA and what's required for FDA approval, the amount of, the amount of investment that's required to move through the stage gates of R&D of a development of a new drug, the scale of the investment is quite significant. And so you have to be pretty confident that you're going to get, a positive outcome to justify that investment. Upstream oil and gas is another example where, if you're, drilling offshore, that they've, you have to go through a lot of rigor in terms of confidence, in terms of what, what outcomes are going to get in order to justify that investment. I think the other area where there's a lot of advancement is in, data-rich environments where people are inherently used to being able to be agile to what the data is telling them. So so technology is a good example, and being able to pivot very quickly to alternative courses of action based on what the information is telling them. But look, frankly, there's one of the challenges of making effective decisions is that historically organizations, sectors have been can be afford to be, I guess, somewhat insular, and they can sort of put a wrap around their business, their stakeholders, etc. But the world's very different now. If you're a industrial operator, there's so much more consciousness about the fact that you live and operate and work in a broader context, and you've got communities in which you operate. The expectations for social license are much greater, and so the challenge then is that you've got multiple people with multiple perspectives, and so how you bring those perspectives to play and how you actually come up with a solution set that addresses the needs of those different people with their different objectives is challenging. Especially when historically organizations haven't necessarily been encouraged to be open and to be inviting the community in as part of their decision making processes. So it is going to be challenging, and I think climate change is going to amplify that challenge.
And I know that your area is kind of consulting on this and giving organizations kind of advice or working with lots of different stakeholders. I've just got these attributes that you passed on to me that I thought were a great framework for decision making and thinking through the risk and uncertainty of climate. Could you give a concrete example of something and how it relates to these?
Yeah, I'll over the last couple of years with the company I've just left, actually, we were fortunately invited by leaders of the Reef Restoration and Adaptation program here in Australia. So the RAP, it's acronym. It was an 18-month sort of concept feasibility study to study potential interventions that would help us as a nation, help the Great Barrier Reef resist and adapt to the impacts of climate change. So the Great Barrier Reef has had 3 mass coral bleaching events in the last 5 years, and it's been there's the urgency as indicated by the last outlook report by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority is it's critical, mission critical at the moment in terms of being able to protect and help the reef be resilient to these changes. And so that was an 18-month study, and the program is quite a comprehensive effort to study these interventions and to understand what can we do at scale to solve this problem. And so this program was working for about 12 months, and amazing cohort of academics and scientists and engineers and subject matter experts doing very diverse things around advancing particular interventions, everything from large scale sort of cloud brightening to help create more radiation of sunlight to keep temperatures cooler, to looking at individual DNA of particular corals, to artificially growing corals. You had coral modelers trying to understand what are the impacts of climate change on individual corals and the reef as a whole. You had social scientists looking at community attitudes and looking at what's the actual economic value of the reef. How does the reef contribute to Australia's GDP and broader value dimensions. There's work around the tradition owner connections to the reef, which is critically important and has 10,000 years plus of history to draw upon. But one of the challenges, I guess, that all these people had when they came back together was that ultimately the program had to demonstrate an investment case. Is this program worth investing in? Is R&D on these interventions a worthwhile investment? And does the benefit exceed the cost? Because we're not talking sort of small numbers here. So we were invited in by the leaders of the program to help with taking all this amazing, fantastic information that had been generated over the past 12 months and advancing the knowledge of the reef and knowledge of these interventions and the broader socioeconomic community. And actually turned that into an investment case that made a compelling case that this was something worthwhile investing in. And so we the first thing we did was to come in and sort of ask what we always do, which was, well, what's the frame here? What are we actually trying to demonstrate? And when we surveyed, a number of people across the program, we had not massively divergent perspectives, but we had very, very useful different opinions on, well, what are we trying to achieve? And this is very common in many contexts. People have got a slightly different opinion on, well, what are we trying to do and what are we trying to solve? So the first thing we did was to sort of bring some alignment around, well, what in developing an investment case, what do we need to prove out here? Is it to show that we've got a silver bullet solution, or is it to show that this program is investable? And there's different opinions across that spectrum. And ultimately, we help them land on, well, we want to prove out that this is investable. And then we use those sort of other steps of that process that you flicked up there to get to a point where the program could demonstrate that, look, this is, there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of things that we need to learn and study, etc. But if we get this right, the upsides are so significant that this is a very worthwhile investment to make. And so the program's now sort of moved on into the R&D phase. It's successfully got funding and it's a groundbreaking program, not just for Australia, being the world's largest sort of most comprehensive investment into coral reef interventions, but in terms of demonstrating how multiple organizations can come together to solve really complex environmental societal problems.
And what are some of the challenges that someone like you has to kind of quickly come to terms with when you walk into that space where you've got so many different organisations? Because I'm imagining it's not just conservation groups or the Great Barrier Reef Foundation itself, but there are, as you said, traditional owners, and then there are, I'm imagining, researchers as well, universities. What sort of things, as a consultant, when you go into that space, are you thinking this is a priority of what I have to get my head around to help these organisations make decisions together?
Yeah, look, I think it's important. Every situation is different, and this program, I think, the fantastic starting point for us as consultants coming in was that there was really strong passion for saving the reef, universal. Like everyone was there, in that basis. And if anything, we as consultants being paid, whereas a lot of people there, there's a combination of funds and pro bono effort, and because of their deep knowledge and history of the reef. But typically, coming in, one of there's a multitude of challenges. You're trying to, I guess, navigate through, individual and organizational, lenses on the problem, and that's more about so the coral scientists have a particular perspective, the social scientists have a particular perspective. It's probably less about the organizations and more about the domains that different organizations are providing to the program. And then you're trying to find, I guess, you're trying to design your approach to make sure that people's voices are heard, people's knowledge is brought to the table, fulsomely. But then you can be, you need to be objective as well about what's being put forward and what's being presented. So I think gaining trust is sort of the first piece. Demonstrating that being objective is usually a good starting point for that. And then a lot of the process we deploy is really about getting that commitment to action. So, and that commitment to action is really a combination of using the hard facts and the hard data, and people trusting that, but also understanding people's own individual and organizational lenses and objectives, and navigating through those and coming up, hopefully helping them come up with an outcome that is within the boundaries of all those different dimensions.
And not just what is probable, but what's possible, and what is possible within the realms of current funding versus future funding potential. So what stage is everything at the moment?
So I think the concept feasibility study ended last year. So the R&D phase has commenced, and it's there's different sort of elements that have already started in the program. It's a 4-year program, this R&D phase, so it's sort of about 6 months in. And there's a whole bunch of science work at the moment on work streams across the intervention science, the social license components, the modelling. There's a lot of work that's going to be commencing pretty soon on better understanding of the whole GBR system, in terms of understanding the impacts of climate change and understanding the ability of these interventions to actually mitigate those impacts or restore where damage might have occurred due to things like coral bleaching. So yeah, it's sort of early days in the R&D phase, but I think within a couple of years it's going to be in a point where the program's going to have made some real advances in a number of the interventions, and perhaps had a narrower list of interventions that I think are really compelling to move forward with.
Yeah, and hopefully we can stay up to date with that, because I know, that's the thing. It's there's a lot of public interest in the reef, not just locally but internationally. Obviously, it's an internationally renowned area of biodiversity, tourist destination, as well as obviously it's got heritage value. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to see this happen, because it was definitely a huge public story, that all the money that was never seen before, amounts of money going into this, and then to see the process of how it's all kind of shaking out in terms of making sure that money gets spent in the way that is going to be most beneficial to the reef, and all of those industries and individuals who kind of value it for different reasons. It must be, it's complex, but it must be kind of a dream thing for someone like you who loves this complexity to work on in another way.
It's career defining sort of experiences. Really humbling to have been invited to be one of the 100. There's been, I think, over 100 sort of different individuals that have sort of been invited at various stages to provide their expertise on the program by the leaders. And I think what's great is from a decision standpoint, decision support is front and center in the program design. So there's a real, buy-in and emphasis on making sure that, as that program progresses, there's good decision making, transparent, defensible decision making that guides, the program. And so that gives me a lot of confidence that, the public funds that are being invested, having been, got a front seat view of it, I guess, going to be invested effectively.
Yeah, and I think now is a great time if you are watching. I know I've got some people who are watching here in Simpatico TV. We've also got people watching on YouTube and Facebook. Feel free to ask questions as we go. I'm speaking with Mayuran Sivapalan, who is a risk, uncertainty, decision-making expert. He's come from an engineering background, if you missed that part of the episode, and works on these complex sustainability issues and helping different organizations in public, private, and otherwise make better decisions collectively and, as individual organizations as well. So we've been talking about the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, specifically one of their projects. I know there are many. You're working specifically on one of the projects on reef restoration and adaptation, but there are so many others. So it's great for us to have the opportunity to talk to different people who are involved in that kind of decision-making process today. If you had something as advice for me as someone who's, running a show like this and doing different episodes to see what's happening around Australia and neighbouring nations and how we're all tackling so many different aspects of the climate crisis, problems, solutions, adaptation, mitigation, what sort of areas do you think I should be focusing on and highlighting on the show, and the types of expertise I should maybe be, getting people in to talk about?
Being an engineer, I have a bit of a linear mind at times, and so I sort of look at it, a little bit linearly, in that you've got, obviously climate change is happening, and so you've got, I think you had Professor Christian Jacob last week from ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extreme. So that's a really fascinating space, about climate modelling and understanding the different scenarios, because that's going to guide the different decisions and actions people take. So that's an interesting space. I think on the mitigation side, obviously during COVID, what's been really fascinating is the absolute acceleration amplification of investor-driven effort around driving private sector organizations in particular to establish carbon targets, disclose their climate risks, in alignment with good science. And I think so that's people talking to people that are part of that space. I've heard and read quite widely that there's more money available in a lot of these funds for climate action, and yet not enough things to invest in. So I'd love to hear about how are they going about making their decisions on what to invest in, how are they going about finding good projects to target, how they're going about selecting companies to invest in and buy shares in.
And what's the limitation there too? Because I'm wondering, is it just that there's a lot out there and people don't realise? Is it a marketing issue or communications issue where more eligible projects would come out of the woodwork, or is it something else about the Australian kind of economy and industry and things like that means we're not able to take advantage of that?
I think from a regulatory standpoint, we've had a bit of a up and down journey, probably for the last 15 years, really. If you think about, let's say carbon prices was one great example. Industry loves certainty, and in the absence of certainty, it becomes quite challenging. So as much as many organizations, larger organizations, have internal prices on carbon to guide their investments, they're sort of shadow costs, not real, and so it becomes it's a risk mitigation sort of exercise and a risk sort of understanding exercise. But in the absence of that certainty, it does impede. Can impede effort. I think the other challenge, and I think I alluded to it earlier in one of my earlier case studies, was not all organizations are set up internally to actually characterize these other benefits, or risks, if you're talking about a carbon price, for example. And so if your investment framework doesn't quite, if you've got a particular hurdle rate, thresholds that your projects need to meet in order to make a particular investment to release funds, and they don't account for these broader benefits, then you've got a bit of a stalemate. So you can have investors saying, we want you to do more, but you're not set up internally to actually move those things forward. So I think that's a bit of a barrier. I think also it's probably related to where the capital is. So I think there's a lot of money in North America, certainly in Europe, huge. We're talking billions of dollars in these funds, and people are still trying to play catch up. They're trying to understand what makes a good project. It's not clear cut. There's uncertainty,
and it seems very different in terms of the types of investments that get thrown around here, the size they are, the amount of risk aversity of those investment makers in Australia versus in other countries where perhaps it's a lower risk and a higher reward potentially. Here it's like a bit more, maybe it's just a sense I get, but it's a bit more, our startup culture is really very much like still government grants and little tiny grants from government, and every now and then a bit of investment from a private investor, but not always on the same types of things than what you see elsewhere.
I think I'm really excited, and part of the reason for sort of going down the path with Adapts is I just think that the time has come, and I think obviously depending on how the US election results get finalized, I think that's going to create a really strong signal. I think the announcement by China during I think it was about 6 months ago around their carbon targets. So I think that having two nations like that start to move really strongly, setting strong targets, I think it's going to create a huge bunch of momentum, and I think that'll create the conditions for people to actually say, hey, how can I get involved? What are opportunities that I can see more locally? The other, just going back to your earlier question as well, I think the other area I'd love to hear more about in Australia is in the carbon offset space, because I think it's not well understood, but there are going to be question marks in terms of whether we've actually got sufficient offsets in Australia in alignment with our commitments to the Paris Accord.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about how that can actually help our local economy. For instance, farmers and other land managers being able to make income from carbon offsets. It would be kind of cool. But we're definitely having those conversations with some people who have come on the channel, like Casey Whitelaw, who launched Go Neutral to try and invest more in the local market, and people like that. I've just got a couple of questions that have come through on Simpatico. Jason wants to know, he says, hey, loving this chat, firstly. When consulting with stakeholders to help inform risk assessment and decision making, is there a point of diminishing returns on engaging more people, or is it a case of the more the better?
I think there is a point of diminishing returns. So it's obviously very context specific. I think there's, in any sort of decision-making context, one needs to firstly understand who are the decision makers, who's ultimately going to be making the call, and then you have to sort of understand who's actually going to be potentially influencing the ability of that choice to be actually actioned, and for the outcome that we're proposing or we're seeing to be delivered. And so that's usually our sort of frame of reference in terms of who should be part of the journey, as either a participant in the decision making process or someone that's consulted with as the process moves forward. But our lens is always who are the decision makers, and who are the people that could influence the ultimate outcomes of the decision.
Yeah, and Sarah's asking again on Simpatico, but if you are on YouTube or Facebook, you can ask questions there too. Sarah, watching on Simpatico TV, says, "What are some solutions that could be effective in giving reefs more time?" And I suppose that's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, and so part of the program, the Reef Restoration Adaptation program, and I'll also profess I'm not a coral expert, and so I'll what I'm saying is based on me being a sponge for a number of months working as a consultant to the program. I think a number of the interventions, a lot of the elements of the program are actually about how do we actually give the reef time in the hope that the world gets its consensus and moves forward around reducing our contribution towards climate change and hopefully completely eradicating it, such that the reef can naturally recover and restore itself. And so some of the things I guess that are being considered are around, well, how can we climate change might be happening, but how can we at a more local scale prevent the the implications or the amplifications of those effects on local scale coral. So while the restoration adaptation program looks at these sort of novel interventions and looking at applying them at scale, there's a whole bunch of other work that the foundation, for example, funds around reducing water quality, negative water quality impacts on the reef, which work at a much more local scale to prevent that sort of effect of the more global scale implications of climate change. So there's sort of measures like that, projects like that, which are sort of working at that more local scale.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's reef restoration and adaptation is a huge topic in itself, and even restoration as a topic and adaptation as a topic. And like you said, we're not in this position for an either or kind of debate. We just need to prevent and adapt all at the same time. And like you said, some of these things might be about buying time until we get our act together on other fronts. But then that is just one project working with so many other things that are addressing or aiming to address the problem in so many other ways as well. Sarah's also got a follow-up question here. How's climate change affecting the mining industry in Australia? Sarah's in the US, so that's some context for you there. Big question. Yeah. And everyone in Australia is like, not enough.
I will give one. I mean, I won't. I'll give one more very local scale example from an experience I had a couple of years ago. We were working with a miner in the Pilbara, which is sort of northwest Western Australia. Basically has effectively sort of two seasons: a very short wet season and a long sort of hot dry season. And we were working with a company, and they were looking at that existing sort of mining operation, and what they'd have to do is they have to spend money on keeping the mine running and keeping it operating. And so every year they spend X amount of money. It's usually in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on projects to keep everything going. Some of those are just sort of minor fixes and things, and other times it's replacement of infrastructure that's at its end of life. And so we're talking to this project manager, and we're helping him sort of with sort of understanding the risks of delivering a 4-year program of these sort of small projects. And the way they do these projects is within what they call shutdown windows. So these mines typically run 24/7, or they'd like to, and this particular mine site that he was working at has 3 shutdown windows in the year, and these shutdowns last usually no more than about 5 days, 2 to 5 days each time. They have 3 of them, and 2 of them are in sort of the dry season, and 1 of them's in the wet. And he's been there for at that time at least 10 years. And what he was saying was that every year they plan to do these shuts, and in the wet season shut, it's 5 days. basically the way this works is you have a lot of people fly up and they work at the site, and then they're off the site. And so you've got a lot of people. And so when you've got a lot of people, you have to be far more sort of conscious than you ordinarily would be in terms of safety protocols and making sure that everyone's going to be safe. And in the wet season, you have storms and you have floods and that sort of thing. And so what happens is if there's extreme rainfall or extreme wind events, sirens will go off on site and people come off, and they can't continue work until things are safe to be out there again. So what he was saying was that over 10 years ago, before this, in the course of a sort of a wet season, they might have 8 days or so when these sirens would go off. So 8 days in the course of about 4 months, but these sirens would go off. So doing a shut in a 5-day period, we're shutting down and doing a lot of work, not particularly challenging. But what he was saying was that over that course of 10 years, the average number of days where they had to come off site went from about 8 to about 22, and it's just gone up every year. And so now what was happening was that these 5-day shuts that they'd planned in the wet season were more likely to get disrupted. And in fact, the last 3 years, each of those shuts they'd actually had to come off. They had to stop work. And so what that does is if you've got all this planned maintenance and planned upgrade work and you can't get it done, that then increases the likelihood that things are going to shut down or fail in an unplanned fashion, which impacts your ability to produce whatever it is you're producing and impacts your profitability. And so I was listening to him say this, and he's not saying climate change, and I can't say it's climate change, but these are the types of sort of implications that are real, and they're happening now. And it has an impact. It has an impact on production. It has an impact on business. It has an impact on profitability. And I think this is no longer, it's coming, I have to prepare for it. It's happening now, and I might not even realize it, but I could probably find that the evidence of it pretty easily. And this is a classic example of that being the case.
And I think extreme weather events and the occurrence of those, as well as bushfire and bushfire smoke, and there's been kind of, for those people and organisations who potentially weren't factoring those things into their business risk assessments and risk to their profits, as well as risks to their workers and things like that, suddenly you can't ignore it. It's already a risk that's already impacting your business, even if you're just looking at your profits.
That's right. Yeah. And I think this is where the pandemic's going to be really interesting, because I think the pandemic, climate change, at very sort of, in some organizations at very senior levels, you sort of put it in that same sort of bracket. It's extreme. It's, we sort of know it's going to be high consequence, but we're not really sure if it's happening or if it's here. The pandemic's, it's played out, and people are now, I think, very much so, and certainly some of the people I've been talking with are now looking at, well, pandemic happened, this is the other thing that's in that sort of bucket of high consequence, uncertain probability that the people are looking at. And I think the other reason why I think decision making is going to be so critical is that there's only going to be a certain amount of money available, and we only have one chance to get it right. And so making the right calls on the right things, the right time, is going to be so critical, because if you get it wrong, and that can be as a business or as a society, if we get it wrong, that the consequences are so dire.
And this becomes a question as well, not just for business owners or policymakers, but for the people like Dr. Christian Jacob, who I talked to last week from the Centre of Excellence, just talking about the unanswered questions in his field in climate modelling that they really want to be able to get more funding for and do more research on, to be able to make more reliable models so that people can make more reliable decisions around their economic business risk, but also personal risk and safety. It's all connected, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you have a house, or you're looking to buy a house, and you're near a particular waterway, whether it's coastal or even riverine. I'm from Perth, WA, and some of the latest climate maps show, under a moderate scenario, there's some pretty low-lying areas in some pretty high-priced parts of Perth that are going to be inundated. So, when you're looking to buy a house or make an investment in property or something like that, these are the sort of things you're going to want to have, at least one eye on, because
and then from a justice perspective, if it only becomes affordable for people to live out of harm's way, if they're above a certain level of wealth and things like that, we have to really be thinking critically about what that means for people having those basic human rights when it comes to shelter. So yeah, lots to think about. Thank you so much. I've actually taken up a lot more of your time than I intended. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the chat, and hopefully we'll have you on in the future more to talk about decision making, risk and uncertainty as it relates to coral reefs, mines, all things to do with climate sustainability and to do with businesses, economics and beyond. I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for clarifying a few of these graphs that that you sent through. And now I'm going to look at them again with a lot more understanding.
Pleasure to be on, Lee. Thank you so much, and
thanks so much.
Thanks to everyone out there. Cheers.
See you later.
Bye.
Oh, just cutting off Myuran saying bye there, but that was Mayuran Sivapalan, who is the Managing Director of Adaptus there, joining us to talk about solving complex climate challenges and decision making in the face of uncertainty and risk. This is just the first of, I'm sure, lots of other discussions we're going to have, not just on my channel, Climate Australia, but elsewhere in Simpatico TV. Thank you so much to everyone who's been writing in, saying hi, sharing the stream. I saw a few different people sharing the stream on Facebook. Great to see. And hello to those of you who were joining on YouTube as well. I'll be back again tomorrow. Tomorrow I've got a couple of special episodes coming up, which are one is another one-on-one interview. This one will be with Jared Delaney, who will be talking about decolonisation and climate justice in the context of Australia. He is a PhD candidate but has a lot of experience working with organisations like the Bureau of Meteorology on incorporating First Nations people's climate, weather, seasonal knowledge into learnings and into the way that they work. He is a Quandamooka man, so he's actually from up around here, even though he's been based in Melbourne, just like Mayuran, our last guest. They've been going through the pandemic this year and working and studying under some really tough circumstances. So that will be one of our guests tomorrow on Climate Australia. Another guest is actually, it's a whole panel. I'll have a panel coming to talk about public health and climate change. We've got a panel as part of the Better Futures Australia project, which is all about improving the way that different non-profits who are all part of CANA, the Climate Action Network of Australia, are working together on these complex problems. So it kind of also relates to some of the discussions we just heard from with Mayuran when it comes to how we bring different people together and talk about their various knowledge and expertise and move forward on these things we care about the most, whether it's something like the Great Barrier Reef or whether it's, climate action in Australia on public health. So tomorrow's all about decolonisation and climate justice, public health and climate change as well. We'll be hearing from a range of speakers on that panel too. So join us again tomorrow. Thank you so much again to Mayuran for coming along today, and I'll now roll credits, but I'll see you again next time. All right, bye everyone.